Okay, everybody, let's get started. Welcome this afternoon. My name is Sharon Cowley, and I am from the College Board. With me today, we also have Melanie Jones from SDE, and we are going to cover an overview of accommodations. Our agenda for today is going to be focused on preparing SSD coordinators, as well as reviewing common accommodations and looking at the request process. A couple of housekeeping items before I get started. We will, if there's time at the end, take questions and answers afterwards. So feel free to write your question in the Q&A box, and if we don't get to all the questions, we will plan to circulate responses to everybody after the session. We also will make available both the PowerPoint that we are going to review and a recording of this session on the SDE website, so that for folks who couldn't join today, or if you want to revisit the materials we cover today, you can do so. So let's get started. So first off, the test days, I think everybody's probably fairly familiar with at this point, is that all juniors attending public school will take the SAT on either April 10th, the primary test day, or if you have students who are testing with accommodations, they'll test between April 10th and April 24th. And then the makeup test day is April 24th as well. There are, the 2-week window this year will be similar to last year. So certain types of accommodations will be allowed for students to test during that 2-week window. Key dates for the spring 2018 testing. Several of them are coming up upon us in the not too distant future, and those are related to school setup. So all schools provided responses to the intake survey. And so in December, mid-December, you'll receive an AI code for your school confirming all of the school information. That's going to go to the supervisor at your school to make sure that, one, we have all the valid information for the building, as well as to confirm that setup is complete. For some of you that require off-site testing, the deadline to submit requests is mid-December as well, and that will allow us to get those reviewed, approved, and confirmed back to you in January. For all of you SSD coordinators out there, this is the deadline date that you are probably most interested in, and the accommodations requests are accepted through February 19th. We have a registration window that is in January, January 8th through February 2nd. And then your schools will begin to receive materials beginning in late March. And these are going to be pre-administration materials. This year you're going to get answer sheets as well as labels and student guides earlier than you would typically have last year, so that you can conduct a pre-administration session in late March before testing on April 10th. And then your test materials will arrive the first week of April for the April 10th administration. All test materials should be returned April 11th for students that test on the 10th. And then for the accommodated testing window, students will have from the 10th through the 24th, and then the materials will be returned on April 25th. And then for students testing on the makeup administration on the 24th, makeup materials will be arriving in schools again the week before. So the tools that you will have as SSD coordinators to use are going to be consistent with what you had last year. So first and foremost, you're going to use the SSD online system. to enter accommodations requests. You are also going to use that same system to manage those requests. The Non-Standard Administration Report, or NAR, is available through SSD Online, and there have been some significant changes this year that I think you'll be interested in. And then some of you may or may not have used the eligibility roster in the past, but we do have some specific uses for that this year. So testing roles, similar to last year, these are the people in your building who will be supporting testing. The supervisor is going to be responsible for all aspects of the SAT testing. Yourselves as the SSD coordinators will be responsible for requesting accommodations, and then you'll have associate supervisors and proctors, both room and hall proctors, to assist with testing on test day. Some broad strokes of what to expect. In October, as I mentioned, your schools have participated in the intake survey and identified both the test center supervisors as well as the SSD coordinators for your building. And so one of the things that we'd like to have you do, if you haven't already, is just confirm that you have access to SSD Online. And then as we get into November and through January, you will begin to submit your accommodations requests and make sure that you have all of your students identified who need accommodations. February and March, again, you'll begin to receive your materials. April will be for testing, and then in May, you'll receive score reports back. So let's look a little bit at the accommodations and supports available. So these are going to be, for the most part, consistent with last year if you are a returning SSD coordinator. So the things that are available to all students are the ability to repeat directions, give students time remaining notifications, use a calculator in the with calculator sections of the math test, and then we have translated test directions and approved word-for-word glossaries for EL students. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. We also then have our standard test formats where students may have an accommodation that they are using, but the test itself is the same test. And those are for things such as additional breaks, extended time, readers, scribes, etc. And then we have our alternate test formats for students that require large print, Braille formats, MP3, or assisted technology. So as many of you know, the College Board is committed to making sure that students with disabilities can take the SAT with the accommodations that they need, and that we do consider any requests so that we can ensure we are measuring students' academic abilities regardless of any disability they may have. All of the accommodations will be submitted through SSD Online, and students with College Board approved accommodations will receive college reportable scores. Once an accommodation has been approved, with limited exceptions, that student will continue to be approved for that accommodation for all College Board tests. And so for any of you that participated in the PSAT NMS QT last year or even this year, any students that were approved for accommodations as a part of PSAT testing, those accommodations will carry forward for those students. And so your students last year who tested and are now 11th graders taking the SAT, their accommodations are already approved and you don't need to do anything to resubmit them. The only thing you would do is make any changes if their accommodations needs have changed. For our English learner supports, these are college reportable as well, and there is no advance request required. So for translated test directions, we will provide a PDF version of each language that you see listed here on the SDE website. So if you have a student who requires translations of the directions, You may download a copy of the directions for their use. If you have a student who requires a language that we don't provide a PDF for, you may use a local on-the-fly translation by a translator approved by your district or school. Additionally, we have a word-for-word glossary list that contains a list of approved glossaries for the languages listed above. So if you have a student who is an EL student and needs to use a glossary that does a word-to-word translation, they may also do that. So for any of you that are new SSD coordinators, the first step that you are going to need to do is create a College Board account if you don't already have one. To do so, you're going to go to collegeboard.org, and on that primary page, it'll ask you to sign up for an account. Second, once you have that account, you're going to need to complete the SSD form, the coordinator form, that is found on the College Board website at collegeboard.org/SSD. This form is going to ask you to give information about yourself and your school, and does require a principal's signature in order to authorize you to have access to the system. You will return that form to College Board, and within a couple of days, you'll receive an access code. This access code will allow you to link your College Board account to the SSD online system. And from that point on, you will have the access to submit accommodations requests. If you happen to be an SSD coordinator across multiple schools, then you will need to submit a request form for each school that you are requesting access for. You won't have to log in multiple times. Instead, when you log into the SSD online system, it'll simply ask you for which school you are planning to work with. I talked about the high-level roles that we had for SAT administration, but more specifically, the SSD coordinator role is responsible for being the liaison with College Board as well as the test supervisor in your building to support students that are testing with accommodations. So you are going to be responsible for submitting all of the accommodations requests, as well as working closely with your supervisor on scheduling and planning for students that test with accommodations. You'll also may administer the test to students, and you'll be responsible for providing the non-standard administration report, or the NAR. You can think about it as a room roster for the students that have been approved for accommodations. For those of you who were SSD coordinators last year, really you want to just make sure you can still access your College Board account and the SSD online system. And again, if you are an SSD coordinator for multiple schools, you may request access for additional schools if needed, simply by filling out the form. And that form is located at collegeboard.org/SSD. We have a number of new things this year for SAT this spring. So first and foremost, the testing time has been reduced by approximately 50 minutes because you will not administer the essay, as well as the addition or introduction of Accuplacer in lieu of SAT for very specific situations. So Accuplacer is intended for students with disabilities where the SAT or ACT is not appropriate. So there are guidelines posted on the SDE website if you need additional information. In addition, we have the introduction of Idaho supplement manuals. These are going to be with your test shipments and provide Idaho-specific information related to the spring administration. We've also eliminated both the paper registration forms and the admission tickets. And then we have made a significant change to the rosters. So first off, The online attendance roster, or the ETS roster as you may know it, has been eliminated. And instead, we have made some significant enhancements to the Non-Standard Administration Report, or NAR. And so last year, if you remember, you had students with accommodations, some that showed up on the online attendance roster and some that showed up on the NAR. This year, all students that have an accommodation will appear on your NAR. So you will have a single list of all students testing with accommodations. And in addition, we've added information to the report to help you know how to group those students together for testing, whether they can test on the primary day or in the window, as well as what color test materials to use. We have also expanded some of our accommodations information. You'll be receiving this both via email, and you will find some of it in the testing manuals once those are available, as well as expanding our EL support. We've eliminated the pink test book, so this year students will test with either a purple book or a blue book. We've modified the photo ID requirements. You are no longer required to check photo IDs for every student. Instead, you only need to verify photo IDs if it is a student that is not known to you, so that should simplify your check-in process. And we've combined the student data questionnaire and the answer sheet for less paperwork. The other thing that's a little bit different this year is something that we're calling consolidated roles. So this year, we have identified the test supervisor as being responsible for planning the administration for all students, both those with and without accommodations. In your role as the SSD coordinator, you're responsible for applying for accommodations, as well as providing the NAR to the supervisor. And similar to last year, you will help plan for testing those students with accommodations. However, your test supervisor will receive all material shipments, and they will also be responsible for returning all material shipments. And the reason for this is that we found in some places it was a little bit more difficult to have those roles split. And so with this, we have a single point of contact at the school to receive and send back materials. So if there are any questions or follow-ups that are required, we know who to go to and who was responsible for returning materials. So let's take a look at the accommodations in general. So this is some of the expanded information about accommodations that you will see this year. So, you know, College Board has a list of accommodations that are most common. We don't have a set list. A kind of unique situation with a student requiring accommodations is something that we will review at any point in time. But for common accommodations, we can go through and help you better understand what those are. So when requesting accommodations for students, we want to make sure that what you're requesting for the SAT is consistent with the accommodations that they use regularly as determined by their IEP. And we do recognize that some of the College Board terminology may be different than what is specifically stated in the student's IEP or 504 plan. So for example, if you have a student who has an accommodation of read aloud or human reader, you have the option where you may choose to request a reader or choose the MP3 audio version. We'll talk a little bit more about the differences between those. So you have the ability to determine the best option working with the student and their family. We also will go through the various accommodations. As I said, while we are going to look at some very common ones, we will accept requests for any new accommodation or unique situation you have for students with a disability. And the other thing is, as a reminder, for timing accommodations, you want to make sure you remember that students will sit for the entire time that they are allotted. We do not have self-pacing, so they won't be able to move to the next section even if they complete it sooner than the time allowed. So let's look at those timing options. We have both 50 and 100% extended time. The SSD online system, you'll also see more than 100% extended time, but the most common ones are 50 and 100%. Here you'll see that there's a variation in the duration of testing. If a student is testing 50% extended time for reading, that's going to be a one-day accommodation. For those of you who participated last year, you may remember this being a two-day accommodation previously. And that is because of the fact that students were taking the essay last year. And so that caused the timing for the test to be too long, and thus it was broken over 2 days. But this year, since you are not using the essay, that timing will be one day. Again, for each of these extended time options, you'll see that the students will receive the time for either all sections, if it's the reading accommodation, or just for the math section, if they only need assistance in timing for math. But in any case, students will must use the entire time for which they are approved. You will also notice that with each of these, students are going to automatically be approved for extra breaks. So if you are requesting extended time, they will automatically get extra breaks as a part of that request. You do not necessarily need to submit it separately. If we look at the break accommodations, these are the same breaks as we had last year. One thing to call out here is that when you're looking at breaks and timing, you want to make sure that you are thinking through the true needs of the student. And by that I mean, if the student has a disability that creates an impact to their ability to take the test, so maybe they have a disability that affects their math calculation abilities, then what they really need is extended time for that particular section, for example. But maybe they often use extended time in the classroom so that they are able to get up and use the restroom when needed, get a break from classroom work to help them focus, etc. And so in that case, you want to look at breaks. The difference here is really, do they need more time on the clock, and that would be extended time, or do they need extra time off the clock, which would be a break? So with extra breaks, students are given a break halfway through the longer sections with a break after every section. So they're going to get more breaks than a student that does not have that accommodation. Whereas with extended breaks, their break time frame is going to be doubled. So in the standard course of testing, students may get a 5-minute break at a particular point. Students approved for extended breaks would get 10 minutes. This is often one that is used for students who require permission to eat or take medication while testing. And then finally, we have breaks as needed, which is typically for students with some type of physical or medical condition, but this allows the students to determine when they take their break. So they may be able to, if they need a break, they request the break. This one requires the person administering the test to the student to capture and record the time carefully, because their time will stop at that point until they come back. And so they still need to get their full allotment of testing time. instead of the planned breaks, they are going to break at potentially different times. And so when using this accommodation, sometimes they also need other accommodations, again, such as permission to eat or take medication while testing. We then have our reading and seeing accommodations. MP3 audio and the reader is the example I used earlier. And so both of these serve the need for a student who requires the test to be read to them. However, they have different implications both for the student as well as the school when administering. So the MP3 audio version will be a 2-day testing time frame. And in this case, a student is going to automatically receive 100% extended time because they're going to need time to be able to control the MP3 audio player. So if they want to re-listen to something, replay it, go back, go forward, they will need the time to manipulate the audio format. What's nice with the MP3 version is that it is delivered on a flash drive, and students, more than one student can be administered the MP3 audio version if they are all in the same room, if they are all using headphones. Whereas with the reader, the student will have the SAT read to them by an adult. That person needs to meet testing staff requirements, and in this case they're also going to get extended time, but only 50% extended time, because it is much quicker to simply ask someone to reread a passage, for example, than to find it on the MP3 audio. And so in both these cases, the students need to sit for the entire time, but with a reader, this is going to be a one-to-one setting versus the MP3 audio that can be administered in a group. For the other reading and seeing accommodations that are most common, we have our assistive technology format and the Braille format. These are one-day tests. The assistive technology is going to also provide extended time for the student. It's delivered on a digital version, and so it will work with a variety of devices. And then with American Sign Language, that accommodation allows for the test directions to be translated into sign language, and those interpreters, similar to a reader, must meet all testing staff requirements. For recording answers, we have the writer and scribe as an option. And for setting, both small group and home or hospital settings are available as well. Again, these are all one-day accommodations. You are going to want to kind of plan accordingly based on whether or not there's extended time provided with them, as well as how to plan your rooms. So let's look a little bit at the SSD Online system and how to prepare. So we are looking at the dashboard, which is your landing place once you log on to SSD Online. This is going to tell you what students have accommodations requests underway. It will tell you whether they're approved or not. This will be where you can run an eligibility roster or a non-standard accommodations report. So one of the first things that we are going to recommend that SSD coordinators do is to review your students. So the first step in looking at your students for spring testing is to identify who's going to be testing and confirm their accommodations. You can either look at the dashboard to look students up or print the eligibility roster, and this roster will give you a listing of all students at your school approved for accommodations. If you have new students or students who have not had accommodations requested previously, you're going to submit those requests into SSD Online. And then you are going to want to take a look at your students who may have previously been approved, again, using that PSAT and MSQT example, if you have students who had approvals for last year, you're going to want to take a look at their information. Make sure that their student information is correct, their name, their birth date. You also want to make sure that the accommodations are still appropriate. If they are not, you have the ability to change their accommodations, and we'll show you how to do that. If you do have students that are no longer at your school, 12th graders are going to fall off automatically after they graduate. However, if you have students who have transferred, you can remove those from your dashboard. And we'll talk again a little bit more about how to do that. So when a request is submitted into the College Board's SSD Online system, there are two paths that can go down. The first are school verification. So for any of you who submitted requests after January of last year, you may have found that the request process has gotten much quicker in terms of approvals. And that's because of the school verification process. Depending on the information that you enter into the system and what you verify based on the student's plan, those accommodations can be automatically approved, and you get the approval within about a week. Though there are certain types of accommodations that will go through our documentation review process, and these are going to be requests that involve 100% extended time, as well as assisted technology, or large print test books greater than 20. And any type of request that you submit as other through the SSD Online process. And these will require documentation so that we can just better understand the student's needs, and so the review process will take a little bit longer. The guidelines, if you are asked for documentation, are really looking to address the three questions that you see on the left. What is the student's disability? How does that disability functionally impact them? And why does the accommodation meet the need for addressing that? So documentation can be almost anything that you have, and really looking at what was used to make the determination at the school. It could be specific reports on the student, testing results, diagnoses, etc. But it also can be surveys or feedback, report cards, anything that answers basically how does the accommodation meet the functional impact and solve for that functional impact. If an accommodation is not approved, you can resubmit it at any point in time, even if it's after the deadline, and provide additional information. So let's take a look at the request process. For those of you that submitted last year, this is going to look somewhat similar to you. The first step of the process is going to be to choose Submit Accommodations Request in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. From there, you are going to be asked whether the student has already been submitted for an accommodation or if they are a transfer student. The reason we ask this is to help you more readily find students that might already have an accommodations request that have moved into your school. And so by answering no to each of these, the system is going to recognize that this is a new request, and it will then take you to the next step. If you answer yes, it is going to then look for student information, and we'll see how that transfer works, but allow you to then transfer that student to your dashboard if they moved to your school. But let's assume this is a brand new request. You're going to get a confirmation screen around parental consent. Essentially, the College Board provides a parental consent form in the site so that schools may use this. We do not collect this form, and we do not require you to return it to College Board. Its purpose is really to protect the school and to make sure that the school is authorized by the student's parents to share information with the College Board. And so this can be collected in any number of ways. You may automatically already collect this as a part of your IEP process. You may have district policies for collecting this in follow-up meetings and or phone calls with parents, or you may choose to use the form that we provide. But assuming you have consent to share the student information with College Board, you would then submit the student information. And this is the first screen. You're going to provide the student's name, their date of birth, their graduation date, as well as their address and gender. You will choose the next intended College Board test. In this case, it'll be SAT and April of 2018. And from there, you'll be asked to choose the student's disability. You will check any and all that apply for the student, and if for some reason it is a unique situation, you will have the option to choose other. Just remember that if you choose other, it will require documentation for us to get a better understanding of what the situation is with the student. You'll be asked to confirm the disability that was selected and a rough time frame for the student's diagnosis. Was it within the last several months or longer? And then you'll be asked to provide the accommodation you are requesting. So here's where you're going to choose the specific accommodation that you need. In the case of the timing accommodations, you're going to have the option to choose whether you need it for reading or math. One thing I will call out for those of you have students last year that had an accommodation specific for written language expression or for writing. If the student requires that accommodation, I would recommend you still submit for that accommodation. However, since the essay is not a part of the administration this year, you will not need an approval for that. However, having the approval in the system will allow the student to use that accommodation for other College Board tests or if they decide to retake the exam for some reason on the weekend. You will then be asked to confirm the accommodations. And so for returning SSD coordinators, depending on when you submitted your accommodations last year, you may or may not have seen this screen. This screen is what helps us with the school verification process. Basically, we are asking the SSD coordinator to confirm if the student currently receives the accommodation and if the accommodation is included in their IEP or 504 plan. By answering yes to both of these, that will assist in that school verification process. It's possible that that is not true, and so if you answer no, then documentation may be required depending on the type of accommodation that it is. You'll then be asked to just confirm the student's plan, the timing of when they had their plan, and the timing that we're looking here is really an estimate. It's really just to gain an understanding of when their initial plan was. So this isn't their annual IEP update. This is really when was the first diagnosis of this disability for the student. And so for most requests, you will see a screen that looks like this. Basically, it's a summary screen that allows you to review the information, and you will see that no documentation is required. For these reviews, you will receive your approval within about a week or so in the system, and you'll be able to see that on your dashboard, but you'll also be alerted that the status has changed. If documentation is being requested, you are going to see a box that says recommended documentation. One thing I will call out is that if documentation is being requested, we are not expecting you to send in each and every one of these items that we show on the screen. This is basically recommended, things that are most helpful when we're reviewing. However, what we are really looking for are the answers to those 3 questions. Provide documentation that tells us what the diagnosed disability is, how the student is functionally impacted, and why the accommodation being requested meets that need. That's what we're trying to understand. When you're done, you'll be able to submit the documentation either online or fax it to us for review. And that's it. When the accommodation is completed, you will be able to see that on your dashboard. And if additional documentation or follow-up is needed, that communication will come to you as well. You'll receive an email from the College Board stating that we have some follow-up questions that you can respond to. So you may have a need for students that need temporary accommodations. These are going to be examples where the student broke their arm, maybe they have a concussion. And so this is not a disability, but rather a temporary situation where they need to be accommodated. So they broke their arm and they need a scribe. There is a form located on, we will be posting it on the SDE website that you can fill out. It will ask you for specific information about the student's situation, and we would then provide an approval for one-time use only. So the student would be approved, for example, for a scribe for the April testing. That doesn't mean that they will get a scribe for all their other testing. It's for that one administration. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about transfer students. So you may have students that have moved from another school into your school, and so they've been submitted previously for accommodations, but they do not show up on your dashboard. So what you're going to do, you can move those students over automatically. First, you'll log into the SSD online system, and you're going to start an accommodations request. So you're going to click Submit Accommodations. That's where you're going to see the screen that asks you if they are a transfer student. And this is where you'll say yes. By answering yes to both of these questions, it is then going to ask you for the student's information. You'll need to provide the student's name, their date of birth, as well as their College Board SSD number. That will allow us to match that student up with the existing record that is in the system and pull them over so they now show up under your school. One of the things you may ask is, what do I do if I don't have an SSD number? So there's a number of ways that you can do this. First and foremost is you can ask the student if they have a copy of the eligibility letter. And recognizing that these are high school students, they probably don't. So another option is that you can have the student log into their College Board account, and in their account, they will have an area called their My Plan, and they will be able to view their eligibility letter. They can simply print out that letter for you. The letter includes the SSD number, and you can use that to do the transfer. Another suggestion is to work with the student's prior school. Any of their reporting, if they log into SSD Online, if they run an eligibility roster, will include the student's SSD number. And last but not least, if none of those options work, you can reach out to us directly, choose our SSD option when calling, and speak to someone on our SSD team, and they can assist in getting the student moved over to your school. If there's a situation where the student now has different accommodations, you're going to have to do a change request for that. So we'll look at that next. So for any student that has been previously approved for an accommodation, or if you need to update student information, you can do what is called a change request. And so from your dashboard, next to the student's name is a drop-down box called Options. And from here, you would choose the Create Change Request option. This will allow you to provide information and submit the additional documentation so that a student's accommodations could be changed. If you have a situation where a student has a name change only, we do have a form online that you can use, complete the information, and we'll make that change for you. You also may have a need to remove students from your dashboard. So students have left your school to transfer to another school. And to do that, you're going to use that eligibility roster. So from your dashboard, you're going to run the eligibility roster report. This is a sample of what that looks like. And you'll be able to see for each student several options. So if this is a student that has moved to a new school, you would simply check the box under the student's name and send the eligibility roster to College Board. So this is that step in planning now that I would recommend you print this eligibility roster and review it. Mark any students who move to other schools. Identify any students that have accommodations that have changed. Maybe you have students that no longer need accommodations, so you need to remove an accommodation from them. Or maybe their accommodation date or graduation date has changed. If you review that, you can then fax this roster into the College Board, and that will allow us to update that student's information for you. And it will also then allow you to remove students who should no longer appear on your roster. So now this is probably the biggest change that all of you need to be aware of, and that is the non-standard administration report. So this is your new NAR for returning SSD coordinators, and it has been changed dramatically. You will now have multiple sections on this NAR. The first is going to be a summary of students. It's going to give you all the student names and the accommodations, their SSD numbers. You will then have a second section, which is a sample of what we see here, which is going to list all of your students who test on the primary day. And so these are any kids with accommodations that are going to test on April 10th. And what you'll see is that there are testing groups on this report so that you can determine what students test together. So anyone that has the same testing group code can test in the same room. You don't necessarily need to know what a T2 means, but these two students who have T2 can be in the same room on test day when they're testing. You will also see a summary of who the students are, what accommodations have been approved, and then here's where you'll see the textbook color that they will test with, along with whether or not it's 1 or 2 day testing, and which script you will begin testing that student with. The third section of the report is going to tell you the students who can test during the accommodated window. So on that version, you may see a variety here where some students will test with purple and some students will test with blue books, and they may test either 1 or 2 days depending on the type of accommodation that they have. So this has been significantly updated to hopefully make room planning and understanding what materials to use with students easier. So one of the things that has also changed is that you'll have the ability to pull in students on the NAR if there are some not appearing. So the NAR is going to initially display any students that were identified in the bulk registration or pre-ID process. But knowing that you may get students that join your school after that date or that late transfer into your school, you will be able to add other students that have approved accommodations onto your NAR so that the NAR truly displays all students with approved accommodations, regardless of when they entered your school. So we will be providing more specific information on that in January and February as we get closer to some of those room planning activities. So finally, just to leave you with a few kind of quick resources, we have our contact information here both for our Idaho field team on the College Board side as well as the State Department team, and links to some of our practice materials, both standard practice materials as well as accommodated practice materials. We also have available large print in Braille versions of our practice materials if you contact our SSD department. So with that, it looks like we've had a couple of questions come in while we have been going. I will move to those quickly before our time is up. So the first question is, are there any differences between accommodations for PSAT and MSQT and the SAT? And the answer is no. The accommodations request process is the same. And if students are approved for accommodations for PSAT and MSQT, those accommodations will carry forward to the SAT. So it's the exact same process. The next question is for requesting accommodations initially, is the Social Security number optional? And the answer to that is yes. The student's name, address, date of birth are required, but Social Security number is an optional field. And then finally, a question around best practices. What are the best practices for determining which students should request accommodations? Who is responsible for initiating whether to request, the student, the counselor, or the parent? So for accommodations requests, the logistical side of it is that an SSD coordinator has been identified for your school, for each school as a part of the intake process. And so that person is the person responsible for submitting the request. And from there, kind of getting to that point to be able to make the request, the identification of a need should be done as a part of your IEP and 504 planning teams. So the request should be submitted by the school, but the determination of accommodations is really being driven out of the defined plan that the school has established for the student, working between your IEP teams and the families. And then one last question is related to the materials that we covered today. All of the materials, both a recording of this webinar as well as the deck, will be posted on the SDE website shortly. And we'll also send out an email version of the deck to everyone who participated today. So I'd like to thank everybody for participating and looking forward to another successful spring administration with you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to either the College Board or SDE teams, and we can assist. So thanks again. I hope you have a great day.